I am shining bright. Hello friends, it has been about a month since I've made a video. Times were unprecedented and now they're becoming precedented again, so real life takes its toll, but you guys have been awesome to me, so I want to continue to be awesome to you by helping you be awesome to your players. So let's get right to it. You guys are here because you want to make a sandbox game. So my name is Zach Dyson, this is Dungeon Master Design, and I am a guy on the internet pretending I know how to make a sandbox game. So let's run the title card so I can look like a professional, and we'll get right to it. The Sandbox D&D game is sort of held up on a pedestal as the elusive golden egg of dungeon mastering. If you can run the Sandbox game, it is somehow proof that you are the best of DMs. And as a result, everybody wants to give their 2 cents about what a DM should be doing when running a sandbox game in order to give the players the maximum amount of agency, or in order to design the perfect sandbox for the players to play in. But I think this kind of mentality can put an unnecessary burden on the DM to do things perfectly for their players, when the whole point of the sandbox adventure is supposed to be that it's sort of loose and fun and everybody can relax and have a good time. The reality is, I think a sandbox adventure in its real core is not much different from a pre-written adventure or even a railroad adventure, dare I say it. I think that the prep that a dungeon master does should be pretty much the same. You're still gonna have dungeons, you're still gonna run murder mysteries, you're still gonna have all the same types of adventures that you would have in any other type of game. The difference is going to be in how you get those players to the adventure. And so I think the real truth is that the real core of a sandbox game is not going to depend on how the dungeon master designs it. Rather, it's going to depend on how the players play in it. Mainly, are they proactive or are they reactive? A sandbox game thrives on players who are proactive, who decide to make their own choices, to go on their own adventures, to initiate the fun. And so our job as the dungeon master then is not to design the perfect sandbox game. In fact, you could design a terrible sandbox game and still have a really fun sandbox adventure if your players are being proactive. So rather than talking about how to design the perfect sandbox game, I think as DMs we'd be much better served talking about how to encourage proactive play from our players. So this is 3 tips for encouraging proactive play in a sandbox game. Number 1 is reward the choices that your players make. And when I say reward, I don't necessarily mean that you should always have things go well for them when they make proactive choices. What I do mean is that when they make proactive choices, it should result in fun more often than it results in nothing. So often I see players take the initiative, do something proactive, make a decision that the DM didn't necessarily think they would make, but then they're presented with or rewarded with nothing, or sort of a bland, boring reaction, or a bland, boring result. They open a door the DM didn't expect them to open, or they talk to an NPC like a nobleman, and then the result is nothing. The DM doesn't know how to react, and so he says, you find an empty cellar behind the door, or the nobleman brushes you off and thinks he's too good for you and doesn't want to talk to you. When we do this as dungeon masters, we are encouraging and teaching our players to be reactive to the content that we present to them, rather than being proactive in generating their own fun. As dungeon masters, whether we realize it or not, we are conditioning our players in a Pavlovian sense to play in a certain way. If one type of play always results in fun, and another type of play always results in something boring or uninteresting, then the players are eventually always going to play in the way that leads to fun. But the reality is that fun is dependent on us, the dungeon master. We need to be ready to respond to their choices with fun outcomes. Maybe when they go behind that door, it is a cellar, but inside there's a talking rat named Scampers. He doesn't affect the adventure, he doesn't change anything on a major scale, but for 5 or 10 minutes, the players have a good, fun time talking to Scampers the talking rat. Maybe he eventually will become a longtime friend of the party, maybe you'll never talk to him again, but something interesting happened when they opened the door. In the same way, when they speak up to that nobleman, instead of the nobleman brushing them off, maybe the nobleman hears them out for a moment and they get to make a persuasion check. If the persuasion check goes well, they've made a long-term ally from someone who has more power and more influence than them. But if the persuasion check goes poorly, now they have a long-term rival, or maybe even an enemy who wants to do them harm and has access to resources that they could never dream of. Whatever it is, start small. Encourage your players by rewarding their little choices, and eventually they'll learn that their choices matter, and they'll start making bigger and bigger choices that result in more and more interesting things. Tip number 2 for encouraging proactive play is that a dungeon master needs to listen and respond. In a sandbox game, more than any other type of D&D game, it's a DM's responsibility to know how to improv just a little bit. And in order to properly improv, we need to be listening to our players and responding to them, not ignoring them or brushing them off and just doing our own thing. And this can take 2 forms, right? We listen and respond in the short-term, immediate sense, and we also listen and respond in a long-term sense with long-lasting results. In the small, short-term sense, if a player says something, does something, goes somewhere, talks to somebody, whatever choice they make, we need to be listening to that, seeing possibly what outcome they desire, and responding appropriately. Maybe in the example of opening the cellar door, they were looking for clues to help catch a murderer, and they hoped to find some clues in that cellar. Now you've listened to them, you know the outcome they're looking for or what they're seeking, and you can put something behind that cellar door that may or may not help them accomplish that goal. But you're listening to them and letting their goals, their desires, their expectations sort of fuel your responses and your decisions so that it feels like a sort of natural, organic ebb and flow rather than the players trying to guess what you've already planned. In the same way, we need to listen and respond to our players on a long-term type basis. We need to hear what their expectations are, what their desires are for the future, what their characters' goals might be, and have those shape the future of the game. Maybe there's a character who's looking for revenge for the man who murdered his father. Pay attention to how that character interacts with new people, right? If he goes to every town and he says, "Hey, do you happen to know a guy who has a scar over his left eye?" then that shows you exactly what that player is expecting and hoping for in the future. He's expecting that eventually, when he goes to one of these towns, someone's going to point him in the direction of the man with a scar over his eye who murdered his father. You learn that information and you get that content by listening to your players. And this doesn't have to just be in-game, right? This can happen even before the game begins. Listen to how your players talk about your game. Listen to how your players talk about their own characters, and I guarantee you're going to hear some things that are going to help you make a better sandbox game and respond to your players in a more organic way. And finally, tip number 3, and maybe the best tip of all of this to encourage proactive play, is that a sandbox game is more about toys than it is about story. And here's what I mean by that. In a pre-written adventure, or in a railroaded adventure, or in a traditional D&D adventure, you're typically trying to tell a specific story. Now the players get to decide how that story plays out, but there is typically sort of an end goal in mind. There's an evil wizard trying to destroy the world, and you need to stop him. There's a cursed magic item that could end existence as we know it, and you need to uncurse it by dipping it in the holy water of the well found at the center of the earth. Whatever it is, there's usually a goal that the players must respond to because there are stakes involved. There's consequences if they don't follow the story and play it out to the end. That's not what we're looking for in a sandbox game. A sandbox game sort of relies on the players being able to say no to whatever story hooks you present to them. So instead of presenting a story to them, we should be presenting toys for them to play with, toys for them to interact with, and the story is going to come from the outcome of what happens when the players interact with those toys, play with them, and do something interesting. And this also means that since the players are gonna say no to a lot of things, that we need to put a lot of toys in front of them, a lot of hooks, right? There's a reason they're called story hooks. We're fishing, right? And fishing takes patience. We're gonna put several hooks in front of the players, and most of them the players are going to ignore. But eventually, you're gonna put a hook in front of the players that seems interesting to them, a toy that seems interesting to them, and eventually they're gonna grab on. So what exactly do I mean by toys for the players to interact with? When I say toys, I mean something that the players can engage with, they can have fun with, they can fight with, whatever it may be, but it doesn't have greater story implications. This could be a dungeon full of monsters with treasure at the bottom. This could be a magic item that does something interesting. This could be a location that catches the player's interest. Whatever it is, the players don't have to play with it, but they can pick it up and play with it if they want to. Like I said, the key to a good sandbox adventure is not you designing stories, it's the players engaging in a proactive way with the environment that you've put them in. And the best way to encourage them to proactively engage with the environment is to make that environment interesting to interact with. And you can do that using these toys, using magic items, dungeons, locations, NPCs. All of these things can help encourage the players to make proactive choices because they want something interesting to happen, and you've given them the avenue to make something interesting happen. You've also listened to them and you respond to them in a positive way. You respond to them in a way that jives with their expectations. And you also reward them for making those proactive choices. You make something interesting happen when they decide to do something they think might be interesting. Now, of course, all of this is just my opinion, my experience. This is what's worked in my games. But I would love to hear what's worked in your games, how you run your sandbox adventures, and how you get your players to make proactive, interesting choices. So leave all that down in the comments, leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you the next time. This has been Dungeon Master Design. My name is Zach Dyson. Thank you so much for watching.